Mr. Walsh had written his autobiography. So
right.
what was your reasoning for delving into his life?
I guess there would be two reasons. Number one, I was so surprised that there had not been a biography on Raoul Walsh in English. There have been several smaller books in Europe, but nothing by any American writer, and I had always been an admirer. And one day I was watching White Heat, and that did it. I said, this is it. I'm going to do this book. As far as his autobiography is concerned, let's just say it's quite embellished. And I took that as a kind of source, not for what to believe, but what to work against, or what truth could I find, behind what's in the autobiography. So, because I already understood that he was a humorous guy, and he never let, as his first wife said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story.
Right.
So,
that was going to be a question of mine. So, actually, to kind of separate the fact from the fiction that he made up about himself and his own life, that was a challenge.
Well, it's also, my first challenge in writing the book was to say to myself, how much of this book am I going to, in the book, how much am I going to talk about this autobiography? Because you don't want to make it a book where you're just rebutting the autobiography. So I had to realize early on that this love that he had of telling a good story and embellishing and having a good time and things like that were part of his aesthetic and part of his persona. So I tried to deal with the autobiography, but not base a book on it.
Right.
There is some information in the autobiography that is truthful. He's pretty truthful about the logistics of his career, where he made a film, what location he went to. But don't forget, he wrote the autobiography when he was very old,
right.
And memory, was not serving him all that well. And for example, he created a sister who never really existed, so he may have been confused. Or I always saw it also as a kind of compensation because he gave the sister the name of his mother who had died very young. But anyway, but what I realized is that in order to understand the films, I had to understand who was making these films. And it became a particular problem in that for example, the biography I wrote earlier than this, the one of George Stevens.
Yes.
Stevens was someone whose films were very personal and had a lot of meaning for him, especially after the war. Whereas with Walsh, I found that there was not that kind of attachment. And that was difficult because you don't see a personal belief system or a personal aesthetic in his film. So when you call him an auteur, you have to be, which you have to do, you have to be looking at things that are traceable and that are repetitive. But he did not have a personal stake in his films the way someone like Ford or Hawks or Stevens or Sirk did.
Well, and so many films to his credit. It's something like 150 films, or
and counting. We don't even know.
Yeah,
so many of them
lost from the silent era. Yeah,
right.
But so obviously he was a very efficient working director. What made him beyond that an artist? Do you think?
I think. Well, I mean, an artist. He would be the one to say, "I'm not an artist. Don't ever call me that." That would just so he was so unsettled with that conception of himself as an artist. Well, I think you don't want to say he's a great technician, but I think his frame is so beautifully realized. The action is very aesthetic. You learn to look at certain patterns on the screen. His love of the outdoors and his sense of freedom of the outdoors, and it becomes almost an aesthetic issue in his films. But he would be the last one to say, I'm an artist, because He thought he was just telling a good story. I guess that in itself, you could say, someone who really knows how to tell a story efficiently and aesthetically is an artist.
Right.
And he knew how to tell a story. He was, as they said all around, most people said of him, he was the best set-up man in the business. You know, he knew how to make a car chase seem twice as exciting as it was, because he knew exactly where to place the camera, you know, to get the most effect out of the action. So there are lots of points that you could say, yes, he was artistic, but he would not want you to say that.
Well, what's fascinating to me about the book, and one of the things that I value so much about it, is that such a grand career, in that it begins pretty much at the infancy of cinema, and just the figures that he's encountered throughout his life and his career and the experience he's had. It's a history of Hollywood filmmaking.
Absolutely. That generation, you know, of filmmakers, they were blessed in a certain way, and I think they kind of knew it. They had a sense of it, you know, that there was never going to be the likes of them again. You know, someone who started like that and had to learn everything at once. I mean, there are only a handful of directors who can say that they learned, you know, from Griffith.
That's what I was going to ask. He was kind of mentored by Griffith in a way.
Absolutely.
Right?
He followed him around. He learned everything from Griffith. He said it throughout his career, that he learned everything he needed to know. But then, of course, that's shortchanging himself, because even with his very first major film, which was Regeneration, some of the critics were already saying, oh, he's gone beyond Griffith. You know, and there would be plenty of people who would disagree with that, you know, but at the time there were critics who thought that he had surpassed him, he had learned well and had gone on his own road somewhat, you know. Regeneration is an amazing film. Wasn't that the first feature gangster film? Well, it's considered to be. That's a very fuzzy thing, you know. I think I mean, you could say that there are things Griffith did which were the first, and then you can find people who would say, you know, silent film scholars who would say, oh, no, I can tell you, you know, there were 4 or 5 earlier. But I guess for the record, yes, that was one of the very first feature-length gangster films, yeah. So what surprised, in your research of him and his experiences, what surprised you the most to learn? What surprised me the most? Wow, that's a good question. What surprised me the most was how serious he was. Because, you know, he has this reputation for being, you know, someone who likes to party with Errol Flynn, you know, who liked to go out at night with the Irish Mafia. But what really surprised me was even so when he was so young, how serious he was about getting details, getting films made on time, coming in under budget, you know, if he could. And I think the seriousness was surprising. And the other thing that was surprising to me was, I shouldn't have been surprised, but his close relationships with the crew he worked with, and Errol Flynn especially. They were so close. You know. Well, I look at his accomplishments and the you know, introducing John Wayne and working. Well, John Ford would not agree with you on that. Yeah. I know. There's always a counter story in Hollywood history. I've learned this. There's always a different story. You think something is gospel, and then you hear it told another way by some associate. You know. But no, I think it's true though. I think Walsh wins the war on that one. Wins the argument on that one. He did put him in you know, front and center in front of the camera before Ford did. You know, yeah. Even though he was already in small parts. Yeah. What's really unique, though, reading about his long career, and this is over a 50-year career making films, and all the wealth of experiences he had. I mean, the world of movies and the business of movies had to have changed so rapidly in those 5 decades. Was he good at embracing that change? Yeah, I think he was. I think, you know, he'll say it before anyone, and he did. I was the least affected, the least traumatized by sound of any director I knew. any director I worked with, some couldn't handle it. I don't think it's true. I think most did handle it, but Walsh was always, at least the way he tells it, and he is backed up by certain newspaper articles at the time, that he was eagerly embracing sound. And that fateful year in 1928 when he lost his eye, he was on his way to making what was the Cisco Kid, which became In Old Arizona, and that would have been one of the first outdoor sound films. And I hesitate to say anything is the first, because I find that's not always accurate. But it would have been the first well-known, if not the first, sound film, and he was eager to get with it, to embrace a new technology. And the same thing when it came to CinemaScope. When his friend Alan Dwan was saying it's no good for anything, but a boa. I think it was Dwan who said nothing but a boa constrictor. There was Walsh embracing CinemaScope. He believed in it. He was excited by the element of any kind of story making device. And so 3D.
That had to have. I mean, that's a way to keep relevant as an artist too.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, eventually you have to become irrelevant.
Yeah.
So to speak. I mean, you just do eventually. I mean, you don't become irrelevant. Your work is on film, but you get old, and you can't move as quickly, and your story sense kind of fades. I mean, it happens to everyone. Some at a later age. I mean, his last film, A Distant Trumpet. There are some critics who argue that it's just as good as the action scenes in it are just as fine as those you find in They Died with Their Boots On. Right. Then there are some critics who will say no, it's just kind of a hollow, image of it. But he was devastated about having to use Troy Donahue. By the way, I think I say that in the book. Mm-hmm. He knew that he wasn't getting those wonderful actors, that he was used to.
Well, we talk about this. We do talk about this a lot on the show, in that what happens to the artists as they age. Mm-hmm. Does their work have the same energy or the same kind of probing curiosity or vitality? I mean, did you not find that with Walsh? Or?
I think the vitality was there. I think what happened with Walsh, and I do say this in the book, is that his story sense began to dim. His vitality in terms of action never dimmed. I mean, it never faded, really. It was story material changed. He was very close with John Twist, and some of the material that Twist was writing, for him and with other writers, wasn't really up to snuff. The way, he would never have writers the way he did at Warner Brothers, of course.
Right.
They were the best. I mean, he never worked at MGM really, but Warner Brothers had great writers. And for those first 10 years, he was really riding that wave with those wonderful writers. And I don't know, in the 50s, he really did lose his sense of what made a good story, I think. It kind of faded on him.
Mm. Was how was he looked upon by his colleagues? I mean, is there a Walsh influence at all you can feel?
You find directors who, like, if you talk to Peter Bogdanovich, mm-hmm. you hear him say, well, I learned, he would say Walsh was a man's director, that action, and I learned about action from Walsh. But I don't know about the influence. I think Walsh kind of stood alone. I've heard, like Mike Nichols say, I was so influenced by George Stevens' style of editing. And I'm sure, that you would, I have interviews in the book of people who say, I learned a lot about setups from Walsh. So it depends on, what you're talking about. But across the board, do we know that Howard Hawks has really influenced anyone? I don't really know. You know what I'm saying? I think in certain technical aspects and in certain sense of vitality. In the noir category, White Heat, people probably are patterning their work after him for years, Well, but I haven't heard it said directly.
Well, and I'm sure that it's something that it's difficult to even perceive. But someone that was so productive from such an early period of time in the landscape of cinema, I mean, the influence, it has to be there because he was there from the beginning and he was doing it right and often.
Well, I guess you could say, that he and like a director like Curtiz, a friend of mine's writing a book on Curtiz, and you think about all of these wonderful, I guess I tend to think of them together as these wonderful Warner Brothers directors.
Yeah.
These tough guy directors, and I think the influence is enormous. But I also think it's so awesome to people that, gee, can one ever reach that? Because when culture changes, story changes, characterization changes, writers change, everything changes, and you lose it. You lose it. But the influence, you'd like to think it's there. And you'll hear people say now and then, oh, the way Walsh did it, or the way Stevens did it, or the way Hawks did it, But I don't know about the actual direct influence, if you can, pin it down.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, if he would have been insulted by the term artist, do you think that he thought about his legacy and what he left behind in films?
Did he think about his legacy? He wasn't obsessed with it the way some directors are, where they save everything because they want everyone to know them later. No, he wasn't like that at all. I think Walsh was very of the moment.
Yeah.
I don't think that would have required more ego than he really displayed.
Yeah.
A sense of, an ego that was self-conscious. That would have required a self-consciousness that I don't think he had all that much, the way some other very large, figures have. I think maybe Houston had a sense of, I'm legend.
Yes.
But I don't think Walsh did that. Walsh was very practical, and he just loved the storytelling. He loved traveling. He loved the adventure of it. So I don't think he had a sense of, oh, this is going to be my legacy. I think he was very proud of, what he did. But he was the first one to say, hey, there were a lot of turkeys in there.
Right.
I just did it the best I could. He was from that generation,
Well, you're writing about George Stevens and Raoul Walsh. What do they represent that you miss most about the movie landscape of today?
I guess it would have to be the sure sense of storytelling. These were great storytellers. And the Stevens was more of an intellectual, self-taught intellectual, an idea man, and a writer. And, Walsh was in it for the pure fun of storytelling, and he did it much better than he would ever admit. I think it's the sense of them being great storytellers. That's I don't find that so much today.
Yeah. And
so let's not go there.
That's a whole other depressing conversation.
Yeah, well, yeah.
So if for our younger listeners out there who need to be initiated with Walsh's work, out of 150 plus films, are there 3 to 5? Are there 3 to 5?
Start with White Heat. Sorry?
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, are you asking me to name some?
Essentials that you consider essentials.
Oh, essentials. Oh, absolutely. White Heat, because of the pure energy and the sense of humor. The sense of play. And then, of course, I would have to say they died with their boots on. The pure sense of romance. Then I would say the Roaring Twenties.
Wow.
And then I would say, for sure, High Sierra, about these doomed characters, And that's another thing that goes hand in hand with Burnett, who is such a wonderful screenwriter and novelist. And then I guess to do something in the silent period, to look at regeneration, and also Paths of Glory, What Price Glory, which is a beautiful anti-war film. So I named 6, but I would definitely start with White Heat. But,
what a career! What an amazing career,
isn't it? And I know it really is. And I've talked to so many people who, men who loved Horatio Hornblower when they were boys.
Yeah.
The one, Gregory Peck and Virginia Mayo and those beautiful ships and the beautiful color and that's a boys' film.
I spoke to a director that said the same thing. I forget what his name was. I'm ashamed, but he directed the best Star Trek movies, and I can't remember his name. But he said he was deeply influenced by that work.
See, yes, I've heard people, of Horatio, and I hear that a lot. And those are things, like when I was a girl, I was influenced by Now Voyager. I mean, these are things that when you see them as kids, you haven't got a chance. They're in there now forever.
Yeah, the bird in your brain.
I was interviewed by an Irish radio station, and the interviewer said to me, "Well, when I was a kid, I was forced to watch all of Walsh's films." He was joking. I was put down on the floor in front of the TV and forced to watch them all, meaning that he loved them all. As a kid. So, but definitely Horatio Hornblower for young boys, definitely.
Is there another figure in the history of Hollywood that you're anxious to write about?
Well, right now I'm starting a book on Douglas Sirk.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because I think there's going to be a lot more there than people know about right now, about Sirk, about his early career under the Nazis. And his fleeing Germany, and I think his melodramas are far more respected now than they used to be.
Yeah.
And whereas Walsh was the one who discovered Rock Hudson. He was the one who saw something there. Although he always said it's kind of soft, but I don't know. He's like there's something about him, but he could never get a good performance out of him. Whereas I think Rock Hudson, when he met Douglas Sirk, looked different on film. Seemed different. Sirk saw him almost like a son figure. Sirk had lost his son early on. That's a very tragic part of his life. But I think, when Sirk met John Gavin and Rock Hudson, I think there was some kind of magic that happened. If there can be magic with John Gavin, I don't know. He won't talk, I heard. I heard he won't talk. He's still around, but he won't talk. Anyway, we'll see. But I think the melodrama, it's just an entirely different road. With Walsh, it was just this one great adventure after another, and you just fall in love with him as a person. You just do. Everybody who worked with Walsh said, "Oh God, I miss that old guy. I miss that old guy."